Before I begin, I need to slip into the tone I always use when recording. It feels strange doing for something like this, but maybe it helps calm my nerves. So, hey everyone, thanks for clicking on the video. If you enjoy true horror stories or real-life park ranger cases, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, and comment if you've ever been to Yellowstone or thought about working there. It really helps the channel, and I read all your comments, even the weird ones. But today is different. I'm not reading someone else's story. I'm not pulling from old reports or creepy internet rumors. I'm telling you something that happened to me. Something I never planned to speak about. Something I probably shouldn't speak about. Honestly, this might get me in trouble. It might cost me my job. I've gone back and forth on whether I should share it at all. But keeping it to myself these last few years has felt like carrying a heavy stone in my chest. And maybe if someone else hears it, they'll understand what I went through. Or at least they'll stay away from the places I should have stayed away from. So here we go. My name is Daniel, and back then, I was a seasonal park ranger at Yellowstone National Park. Not one of the front country rangers who greet tourists at the gates or hand out maps. No, I worked deep in the backcountry near the Thoroughfare region. If you don't know where that is, look it up. It's the most remote area in the lower 48 states. A place where the closest road can be 50, 60 miles away. A place where you can hike for days without seeing another human being. Some rangers love being out there because it feels like stepping back in time. Like seeing the land the way it was before all of us showed up and messed everything up. And in a way, I loved it too. At least at first. The air felt cleaner. The nights were darker. The silence made you feel small, but also free. If you've never been to Yellowstone, let me paint the picture for you. Massive pine forests that smell like cold sap and wet earth. Meadows that stretch so far you can see the heat dancing above the grass. Hot springs that hiss and bubble like they're whispering secrets. Wildlife everywhere, elk, wolves, even the occasional moose walking through camp like it owns the place. There were old ranger cabins, too, some from the early 1900s. They still stood on their original foundations, though a few leaned like they were tired of holding their own weight. My assigned cabin was small and plain. 4 walls, a cot, a wood stove, and shelves with jars of old nails and rusted tools left by rangers long gone. On my first day that season, I arrived just after sunrise. My backpack dug into my shoulders as I walked the trail toward the cabin. I watched the light spill through the trees and melt the frost on the ground. It should have felt peaceful. It should have made me excited to start the new shift. But when I reached the cabin door, I felt something I still can't explain. Not fear, not dread, just a slow, cold twist in my stomach, like the land itself was warning me that I didn't belong there. Not this time. I shrugged it off. Maybe it was just a long hike. Maybe I was just tired from the drive from Montana. Or maybe I should have listened. Later that morning, while checking my gear and making sure the radio still worked, another ranger, Miller, stopped by on horseback. I didn't know him well. He was one of those guys who didn't talk unless he had to, but he always had this look in his eyes, like he knew more than he was saying, like he carried something heavy too. He handed me a list of the usual patrol routes. Then he pointed east, toward a line of thick trees that stood darker than the rest. "Don't wander past that ridge," he said. I laughed, thinking he was joking. "Why? The bears unionize over there?" He didn't laugh, didn't smile, not even a twitch. "Just don't," he said again. Then he told me he had to keep moving and rode off before I could ask anything else. I should probably tell you that every park has its rumors. Old ranger stories about strange things, ghost lights, weird sounds, missing hikers. Most national parks have a few areas people whisper about but never put on official maps. Rangers call them forbidden zones or no-go pockets. In Yellowstone, the stories were older than most of the buildings. Places where compasses spun. Places where animals refused to cross. Places where people vanished without even leaving tracks behind. I'd always assumed those were just legends. Stories told around campfires to scare new rangers. Until that year, the first patrol I took was a simple loop through the forest. Nothing special. I followed a narrow trail lined with tall pines. The sun reached through the branches, leaving thin lines of gold along the dirt. Birds chirped above me. The wind moved through the branches like soft waves. It felt normal. Then, about 2 miles in, the noise stopped. Not faded, not quiet. Stopped. No birds. No wind. No insects. No tree creaks. Nothing. The silence hit me so suddenly that I froze mid-step. My ears rang, as if they were trying to fill the empty space with something, anything. I held my breath and listened. Still nothing. I don't know how to explain it unless you've experienced a moment like that. A silence that feels too big, too heavy, like the forest is holding its breath with you. Probably a predator nearby, I told myself. It was the most logical thing I could think of. Sometimes animals go quiet when a wolf pack is passing or a bear is too close. But I didn't see any tracks. Didn't smell anything. Didn't hear movement. Just stillness. I continued walking, trying to shake off the unease. A few minutes later, I spotted a tree ahead with something odd on it. At first, I thought the bark had peeled, but when I got closer, my stomach tightened again. Claw marks. Deep ones. But what bothered me was how high they were. A good 8 or 9 feet up. Maybe more. Bears can stand tall. Sure. But the marks didn't look right. They were too long. Too straight. Almost like something dragged a giant set of knives down the trunk. I ran my fingers along the grooves. The wood inside was fresh and pale, meaning whatever made them had been there recently. Maybe only hours before. Okay, I whispered. Time to turn around. I made light of it in my head, but I could feel something prickling under my skin, a sense of being watched. Even though I didn't see anything, I scanned the trees. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed. Nothing lived. That silence again, like a thick blanket around me. I stepped back from the tree and forced myself to keep walking. The whole way back, I felt the eyes on me. From behind, from above, from everywhere. But each time I turned, the forest looked normal. Too normal. When I reached the cabin, I shut the door harder than I meant to. Dust drifted from the ceiling. My heart still felt like it was beating in my throat. I poured some water into a tin cup and sat by the window, watching the trees. The forest had returned to life. Birds were calling again. Branches swayed. A squirrel hopped across the grass like it didn't have a care in the world. Everything looked the same, but I didn't feel the same. I kept thinking about those claw marks, the silence, that strange weight in my chest, and Miller's warning. Why tell me not to go past the ridge? What did he know? I told myself I was overthinking it. I was tired. New season nerves. Nothing more. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Something had changed the moment the forest went silent. That night, I wrote a short entry in the cabin log, like I always did after patrols. Day 1, clear weather, trail stable. I noticed a possible bear sign on the north point. I didn't mention the height of the marks, or the silence. At the time, I didn't know why I left that out. Looking back now, I think I already understood. If I wrote it, it would be real. And I wasn't ready for that. As the sun set behind the ridge, the sky turned a deep red, like glowing embers spreading across clouds. I stood outside for a moment, watching the colors fade into darker shades. The air grew cold fast. My breath came out in pale mist. I felt like watching it again. Not from far away this time. It felt close, like something was standing right at the tree line. But when I looked, I didn't see anything. Only the shadow of the pines stretching across the ground. I locked the cabin door that night. Even though we rarely locked anything out there, it felt like the right thing to do. Right before I blew out the lantern, I whispered, "It's nothing, just a long day." But even as I lay on the cot, staring at the ceiling, I knew I was lying to myself. Something had shifted in the forest. Something had noticed me. And what happened today, it was only the beginning. The knock from the night before stayed with me, humming in my bones long after the sun rose over the treetops. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt that same pressure against the door, as if something stood there still, waiting for me to open it. When morning came, I told myself to focus on work. but fear has a way of leaking back into the cracks. My second day on patrol began like any other. I strapped on my pack, checked my radio, and stepped outside into the cold morning air. The sky was pale blue, thin clouds drifting like slow breath across the horizon. Everything should have felt normal, but the forest felt different, heavier, as if the trees were leaning closer. I followed a trail that looped west and curved back toward the eastern ridge. I didn't intend to go far, not after yesterday, but I needed to clear my head, or prove to myself there was nothing to fear. About an hour into the hike, I spotted tracks pressed into the dirt near a clearing. At first, I thought they belonged to an elk. The shape was almost right, but something was wrong. The size. Each print was twice as big as any elk print I had ever seen, and the deepest ones went 4 inches into the earth. No elk is that heavy. I crouched down and ran my fingers along the prints. The dirt was damp, not muddy. Anything that could leave an impression that deep had to be massive. The stride was longer than any large animal in the area. Something else made them. I followed the tracks a short distance, but they vanished near a cluster of deadfall, as if whatever made them simply stopped existing. No drag marks, no shift in the trail, as if something had stepped out of the world. I stood and shook my head. Get a grip? I whispered, but unease crawled up my spine. I moved on, trying to pretend the prints meant nothing. Maybe it was an injured moose with a strange gait. I told myself every story I could think of, but none of them eased a knot in my stomach. By midday, the weather shifted. Clouds stacked over the ridge, thick and gray, but no wind came with them. The forest held its breath. My radio crackled. A burst of static hissed through the speaker. I grabbed the handset and pressed the button. Base, this is Unit 12. Copy. Static. I tried again. More static, then silence. I clipped the radio back to my pack. It wasn't unusual for the signal to glitch out here, but combined with everything else, it felt like another warning. 10 minutes later, my GPS flickered, blinked, then froze on impossible coordinates. The screen went dark, then lit again. The little triangle marking my location spun in circles. My compass didn't help either. The needle twitched, swung left, spun full around, then stopped on east. Then it slipped toward the south. What is going on? I muttered. I tried turning in place, holding the compass flat. Nothing. The needle never settled. I turned back toward the cabin. My nerves were too tight and the forest too still. Every sound, or lack of sound, felt wrong. Near the base of the eastern ridge, I spotted movement. I stiffened, but then saw it was just Miller on horseback. That pulled low. He stopped beside me, eyes scanning my face. You all right? He asked. I'm fine, I said. Just weird prints on the west loop, and my radio's out. He didn't look surprised. His gaze drifted toward the ridge. You didn't go up there, did you? He asked quietly. No, just near it. He tightened his grip on the reins. Stay away from the eastern ridge. His voice was low, almost a whisper. Why? I asked, what's up there? He didn't answer. He nudged the horse forward. Miller, I called. Seriously, what's going on? But he kept riding until he vanished into the trees. I stood there for a moment. He knew something. Something he didn't want to say. As I headed back, the air grew heavy. The light dimmed even though it was early afternoon. When I reached a bend in the trail, I froze. Several tall pines were bent, every one of them leaning in the same direction, like pushed by a massive force. But there had been no storm. No wind strong enough to bow trees like that. Some trunks were cracked halfway up, split as if something had twisted them. I stepped closer. The cracks were fresh, pale wood exposed, sap sticky around the edges. I whispered, please be natural, but nothing about it was natural. Pushing through brush, my foot hit something hard. I looked down. A wooden board stuck out from under the roots. I crouched, pulled it free, brushed off dirt. A sign. Old. The letters faded, but readable. Restricted, do not enter. A chill ran through me. I looked past the sign into the trees. No clearing. No post. No visible trail. Just a dense brush leading to a narrow path not shown on any map. Even the old maps didn't show it. Someone had tried to warn people away. Long ago, I set the sign back and stepped away, feeling watched again. Every instinct screamed at me to leave. The sky darkened as I reached the cabin. Shadows stretched across the ground. The silence followed me like something alive. Inside, I lit the lantern and checked my radio again. Static. My GPS wouldn't turn on. My compass twitched on the table, the needle jumping every few seconds. Night settled. The forest grew quiet. Too quiet. I sat on the edge of the cot, unable to relax. Then I heard it. Soft footsteps circling the cabin. Not heavy like a bear. Not light like a deer. Steady. Slow. One step. Another. Another. I held my breath. The steps stopped near the back wall, then moved again, shifting closer to the front. I grabbed my flashlight, but didn't go to the window. Some instinct told me not to look. The footsteps circled once more, then stopped at the door. A single knock echoed through the cabin. Heavy, deliberate. I stood frozen. The sound vibrated through floorboards. The knock didn't come again. Outside, the footsteps never returned. The silence wrapped around the cabin, thick and unnatural. I didn't move until my legs gave out, and I sat back on the cot, staring at the door. Something had been out there. Something that knew where I was. I didn't sleep, not even for a moment. I sat awake, listening to the silence press against the walls like a living thing. When dawn finally crept in, I stepped outside and felt my stomach drop. Whatever was walking these woods at night wasn't wandering. It was searching. The morning light should have made me feel safer, but it didn't. The air was sharp and cold. I checked the tree line, expecting tracks, but the ground looked untouched. It was as if the night had erased itself. I circled the cabin, scanning every corner. Nothing, but the feeling stayed, the sense that something had stood inches from me while I hid behind the thin door. Inside, I checked my equipment. The radio sparked before going silent. The GPS stayed black. Even my watch had lost time. Everything felt unreliable, like the land was interfering. Maybe exhaustion was playing tricks on me. Maybe the knock was just settling wood. The explanations sounded weak, but I clung to them. A ranger alone cannot afford to doubt his own mind. For a few hours, I stayed close, taking short loops through the trees. Each time, the silence returned. Even the animals avoided the area. No birds, no squirrels. I sat on a fallen log, trying to think. I needed answers, and Miller was the only one who reacted like he knew more. Tomorrow, I will find him and push harder. As evening fell, I chopped wood until my arms ached. The simple rhythm calmed me for a while, but the lowering sun made my stomach twist. Night was coming again. Back in the cabin, I locked the door and lit the lantern. I tried to eat, but couldn't steady my hands. The silence outside thickened as darkness settled. I waited for the footsteps to return. Minutes dragged on. Nothing came, but the calm felt wrong, like the forest was waiting too. I wrote a short log entry, leaving out the worst details. Saying them aloud, or on paper, felt dangerous. When I lay down, I kept my boots on. The lantern burned low. I stared at the door until my eyes blurred, waiting for another knock that never came. But the fear didn't fade. Something out there knew where I slept. Something walked these woods at night, quiet enough to leave no trace. And whatever it wasn't finished. Before trying to rest, I stepped outside once more, hoping the air would clear my head. The sky above a ridge was fading into deep purple, and a thin line of fog slid between the trees. It curled around the trunks like smoke. I watched it drift and realized it wasn't spreading. It was moving downhill with purpose. A branch cracked to my left. I spun, pulse racing, but nothing moved. The fog thickened, then thinned again, as if something large had passed through it. I backed toward the cabin door, keeping my eyes on the trees. Every instinct wanted me inside, but I forced myself to breathe. At last I stepped in and bolted the door. Darkness settled fast. I kept checking the window, even though I knew I wouldn't see anything. Whatever roamed these woods was too quiet, too careful. When I lay down, the silence pressed close. It felt like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for the right moment to move. I stayed awake, listening to the nothingness, wondering what sunrise would bring and what might be hovering just beyond hearing. In that long, sleepless stretch, I realized the fear wasn't fading at all but settling deeper, becoming part of the place itself. The morning after the fog and the footsteps felt strange, like waking in a world that looked the same, but had shifted slightly when I wasn't watching. The silence hung in the trees again, not as heavy as the night before, but still present, like a low hum behind everything. I made some instant coffee that tasted like metal and burnt dirt, and told myself I had to do something different today. I needed answers. I couldn't spend another night guessing what might be walking circles around my cabin. There was an outpost about 10 miles away, one of the older ones used by rangers who monitored the deeper trails. I'd only been there a couple of times, but I remembered an older ranger who sometimes stayed in the supply shed. Helen. She retired years back, but she still came up every now and then to help with paperwork or look over gear. She was the kind of person who knew every tree stump and every ghost story the park had ever kept quiet. And if anyone knew what was happening near the eastern ridge, it was her. I packed lightly, some water, a map, which I was starting to trust less and less, and my broken compass anyway, more out of habit than hope. The trail to the outpost felt longer than usual. The forest kept opening and closing like it was breathing, dense one moment, then spaced out the next, as if the trees could shift while my eyes were turned. Every so often I thought I heard footsteps behind me, soft and careful. When I stopped, they stopped. When I moved again, something seemed to fall into that same rhythm. I told myself it was only paranoia from 2 nights of bad sleep. That was easier than imagining something following just far enough behind the trees to stay unseen. By the time I reached the outpost, I was sweating despite the cold air. The place looked the same as always, a small wooden cabin with a sagging porch and a supply shed leaning to one side like a tired dog. An old flagpole stood outside with nothing on it, but a frayed rope tapping against the metal, the only sound in the entire clearing. I saw movement inside the main cabin. A figure passed near the window. Good. I didn't feel like calling her name into the quiet forest. I knocked on the door. A long pause. Then the door opened a few inches, and Helen's face appeared in the gap. Deep wrinkles, gray hair pulled back, eyes sharp and tired. She frowned when she saw me. Well, she muttered, didn't expect anyone this early. Morning, I said. I was hoping to talk to you. She let me in without another word. The inside smelled of old paper and pine tar. Maps were spread across the table. Some so faded the ink looked like shadows. Helen sat down slowly, rubbing her knees with both hands. You're Daniel, right? She said. The new season? I nodded. Yeah, I'm based near the eastern ridge. Her hand stopped on her knee. She looked at me for a long moment, the air between us tightening. Is that so? She said, not as a question, but like a slow realization. I didn't want to jump right into it. So I started with something small. My radio isn't working out there. Compass is messed up too. Not sure if that's normal. She stared at the table. Some areas have interference. That I know, I said, but this feels different. Silence. She didn't blink. Then she said, what did you see? I didn't want to tell her everything. Not yet. So I started with the prints. The oversized hoof marks. The silent forest. The bent trees. I left out the footsteps circling my cabin until the very end, but even then I softened the details, like saying it aloud might bring the thing back. Helen listened without moving, her eyes fixed on my face like she was watching for lies or weakness. When I finished, I said, have you heard anything like that before? She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Her expression answered for her. I think something is out there, I said, and I think the rangers know more than they're saying. Helen took a slow breath and leaned back in her chair. I wasn't going to talk, she said. Not anymore. But you said you're at the eastern ridge, and that changes things. Why? She didn't answer at first. Instead, she stood and walked to a shelf full of old binders. She pulled one out, a thick black folder with a torn spine, and set it on the table. Dust puffed into the air as she opened it. Inside were old reports, some handwritten, others typed on yellow paper. Missing hikers, strange sightings, patrol logs with thick black markers covering whole paragraphs. I worked in your region back in the 80s, Helen said. Not many rangers wanted that area. Even back then there were rumors, things people saw and couldn't explain. Like what? She closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, they looked older, like she stepped back into memories she kept buried. There's a place out there, she said softly. A place that shouldn't exist. It wasn't on maps then, and it isn't on maps now. Rangers used to call it the Hollow Zone. The name alone made my chest tighten. What is it? I asked. No one really knows, she said. Some said it was a sinkhole hidden by the trees. Others thought it was a volcanic vent that twisted the ground. But the truth is, the land feels wrong there. Like there's a thin skin separating our world from something underneath. Something waiting. I swallowed hard. You've been there? Helen nodded once. It was the smallest gesture, but it carried the weight of something terrible. I was on patrol, she said. Just like you. I wasn't supposed to go near that place, but I didn't know where the boundaries were yet. One moment the trail looked normal. The next, everything felt off. No sound, no breeze. Even the air smelled different, like old stone. I should have turned back, but I saw something in the trees. She stopped, her jaw clenched. When she spoke again, her voice shook just slightly. It looked almost human, she whispered, but it moved all wrong. A cold prickling ran across my skin. What do you mean? It walked the way a person might walk in a dream, she said. Like its joints didn't bend the right way. It shifted in and out of the light, and when it looked at me, it felt like it was looking through me. Not at me. Through. I felt the breath leave my lungs. That strange feeling from the cabin door came rushing back. The sense that something was staring without eyes. When that thing stepped toward me, Helen said, I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the ranger station. It took months before I could sleep without a light on. I left the job soon after. Couldn't go back out there. She rubbed her hands together, knuckles white. They closed off that area officially a few years later. Not because of wildlife, not because of safety concerns, but because something was waking up. The room felt too small. The walls are too close. You mean that literally? I asked. Helen nodded again. The hollow zone changes, expands, breathes. Some years you can get close without feeling a thing. Other years, like the one you're in now, it reaches out. My heartbeat thudded, so hard I felt in my throat. I've seen signs, I said, but I don't know why it's so close to my post. Helen went quiet. Her eyes softened in a way that made me uneasy. Daniel, she said quietly. You said your last name was Hale, didn't you? Yeah. She hesitated. There was another Hale who worked here years ago, a patrol ranger. My blood ran cold. My father, I said, he worked in this region. He died here. Helen didn't respond right away. Instead, she reached into the black binder and pulled out a small, faded map. She tapped a spot marked with a red X. That's where his body was found, she said. I leaned closer and felt my stomach drop. The mark was only a few miles from my cabin. My hands shook as I traced the distance. I didn't know it was this close. I whispered. My mother never told me the details. Most families weren't told much, Helen said gently. The reports left out many things, intentional or not. Her voice grew even softer. Your father wasn't the first. He wasn't the last. Something inside me twisted painfully, like a rope tightening. He disappeared during patrol, she continued. They found his gear scattered. His compass broke. His radio is fried. I thought about my own equipment. The static, the spinning needle, the dead GPS. A sick, slow fear crept up my spine. Did they ever say what killed him? I asked. Helen lowered her gaze. They said exposure, or maybe an animal. But those of us who worked there knew better. When someone disappears near the hollow zone, they don't just vanish. Something takes notice. Something follows. My breath caught. You think the same thing is following me. I think it might have started long before you arrived, she said. Some places remember people, and some places don't let go. The room felt colder then. A stillness spread through me that wasn't calm. It was dread settling into my bones. I need to know more, I said. How do I stop whatever this is? Helen shut the binder with a soft thud. You can't stop it, she said. You avoid it. You keep your distance. And you pray it loses interest. I thought of the knock on my door, the fog, the footsteps circling me with slow patience. I don't think it has, I said. Her eyes met mine, full of pity. Then you have a decision to make. Leave the region or risk becoming part of the legend they tried to bury. The words hit me like a stone. Leave. Run. Abandon the post where my father once walked. Or stay. Stay and face something that moved wrong. Breathe wrong. Watch me even now. When I stepped outside the cabin, the sky was already turning gray. A thin wind cut through the clearing, bending the tall grass in a single direction, toward the eastern ridge, toward the place where my father died, toward the place that felt like it had been waiting for me all along. As I stood there staring, I felt again the faint pull in my chest, a tug, a calling, a quiet whisper beneath the earth. I didn't know if it was fate or something far more terrible. But as I started the long walk back, one unbearable thought followed me through the trees. Maybe I didn't come to this place by chance. Maybe something wanted me back here. I barely slept after leaving Helen's outpost. The walk back to my cabin felt longer than the day before, even though I followed the same trail. Every tree felt taller, every shadow longer. And the whole time, the same thought beat at the back of my mind like a heartbeat I couldn't shut off. My father died only a few miles from where I sleep, and whatever had taken him might be the same thing that was watching me now. By the time I reached the cabin, the light was already starting to fade. I'd built a fire, hoping its warmth would chase away the cold crawling under my skin, but it only made the shadows dance harder. I wrote down a few notes about what Helen told me, but even putting the words on paper felt dangerous. Like naming the thing gave it power. When sleep finally came, it came in thin pieces, shaky dreams full of half-formed shapes moving between the trees. Each time I jerked awake, I thought I heard breathing outside the cabin walls. Slow, heavy, patient. By sunrise, my hands were trembling from exhaustion. I didn't know what the day would bring, but I knew something was building, something waiting to break. It didn't take long. Around mid-morning, my radio crackled to life for the first time in over a day. The static was sharp, frantic. Then a voice pushed through. The ranger station at the southern post. Unit 12, this is Base 2. Do you copy? I snatched the radio so fast it almost slipped. This is Unit 12. I hear you. There's a smoke sighting, the voice said. Near the eastern ridge. Coordinates near your sector. A pause. It looks small, but we can't risk a fire out there. You're the closest. My stomach tightened. The eastern ridge. The very area Miller told me to avoid. The place Helen said held the hollow zone. The place where my father died. Copy, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I'll check it out. The radio hissed again, then went silent. I grabbed my gear, slung on my pack, and stepped outside. The air was cold, but the cold felt different now. Thicker, like the forest was exhaling frost. I took a moment to look east, toward the ridge. The trees there looked darker, pressed together like a wall. A faint thread of smoke rose above them, thin and almost transparent. I started walking. At first, everything seemed normal enough. The trail was familiar, the air crisp, and patches of sunlight slipped through the branches. I tried to listen to the birds, but they weren't singing. Not one. The farther I went, the more the forest quieted. And that quiet wasn't peaceful. It was expectant. A kind of hush that bends around you, making your footsteps sound too loud. After an hour, even the wind went still. Not a leaf moved. The air hung heavy, like I was walking underwater. Then the smell hit me. Faint but sharp. Burned wood. I followed the scent off the trail and through a section of tight pines. The smoke thread grew thicker. Every few steps I paused, listening for any sign of life, but there was nothing. No insects, no rustling branches, no breath but my own. I crested a small rise and stopped. Below me, in a small clearing, lay the remains of a campsite, or what was left of one. Blackened earth, half-burned canvas, a twisted metal frame that might once have been part of an old tent stove. The fire had long burned itself out, but the scorch marks were recent, still warm under my glove when I touched the soil. I walked slowly around the site. Something wasn't right. The gear didn't look modern. The metal was rusted. The canvas was patched with old stitching that looked hand-done. I recognized the style, gear used decades ago by rangers or deep country researchers. I crouched near a collapsed wooden crate, its surface darkened by heat. The stenciled letters were faded, but I could make out the shape of a year. 198. The last number was too charred to read. My heartbeat quickened. This site was decades old, but it had burned recently, very recently. How? I moved toward the nearest tree, needing something to hold on to steady myself. When I placed my hand on the bark, I froze. Carved into the trunk were 3 letters. D.H., my father's initials. The breath left my lungs in a sharp gasp. My knees weakened, and I had to grip the tree to keep from falling. The world around me tilted, the silence pressing deeper into my ears until it buzzed. I traced the letters with my fingers. Rough, shallow, not weathered enough for carvings from the 80s, not new enough to be fresh. Like time itself couldn't decide how old they were. I stepped back, shaking. This wasn't a coincidence. Not anymore. Behind me, the forest creaked. I spun around. Nothing moved, but I felt it. Something watching. Something is studying me the way a predator studies a trapped animal. I grabbed my pack and followed the only direction that made sense, the narrow trail leading away from the campsite. It wasn't on any map. It wasn't marked. But the dirt was pressed down like something had been using it, something with long strides and heavy steps. Each footfall I made felt wrong, like the ground wasn't solid, soft, spring, almost like stepping on thick moss, except the moss pulsed slightly under my boots. I tried to convince myself it was my nerves, but the sensation grew worse with each step. The trees on either side leaned inward, narrowing the trail until I could barely fit between them. Branches scraped my shoulders. Needles brushed my face. The forest was too close, too tight, like it was folding around me. After another 100 yards, the air shifted, heavier, warmer, and something else, a faint vibration beneath the ground like a distant hum. I realized my breathing had become labored, each inhale thick and sticky, like breathing through wool. Then I heard it, whispering. At first, just a suggestion of sound. Then clearer, a shape of a voice, but not one voice. Daniel. I froze. My own name, drifting through the pines in a dozen different directions. Daniel. The whisper came again, closer this time. Then behind me, then beside me. No shape, no form, just breath forming my name. I spun wildly, a flashlight beam slicing through the tight trees. Nothing. But the whispering continued, rising and falling like the wind. Except there was no wind, not even the faintest hint of it. My hands shook. Sweat ran cold down my back. I'm not going deeper, I whispered to myself. I'm turning around. I'm leaving. But when I turned, the path behind me looked wrong. Shorter, thinner, like the forest had moved while I wasn't looking. The trees were closer together. The ground dipped where it had been flat. I took a step back onto the trail, and the forest shifted again. It wasn't the trees moving exactly. It was everything, a slow rearranging, so subtle it made my stomach twist. Panic finally broke through the numbness. I ran. Branches whipped my arms and face. The whispering rose behind me, louder now, urgent, almost pleading. I darted between the trunks. Try and follow the trail back the way I came, but the trees funneled me sideways instead. Each time I veered left or right, the forest closed in, forcing me in a single direction, forward. My lungs burned. My legs trembled. Finally, the trees thinned, and I stumbled into a clearing and stopped dead. In the center of the clearing stood a massive stone formation, tall, arched, like a doorway carved by something ancient and patient. The stone was impossibly smooth, worn down by time or hands or something older than hands. Strange grooves marked the surface. Spirals, lines, shapes that made my eyes ache to look at. The whispering went silent. Everything went silent. I felt my heart thudding in the hollow space of my chest. The stone seemed to pulse, just once, like something beneath it was breathing. Then, from the far side of the clearing, a shape stepped between the trees. Tall, pale, almost human. It moved in a slow, uneven rhythm, like it had joints but didn't know how to use them. Its head tilted one way, then the other, studying me with an empty curiosity. No eyes, no face, but I felt its attention like a weight on my shoulders. The thing took one step forward. I felt my mind fracture around the edges. "No," I whispered. "No, no, no." I didn't remember telling my legs to move, but suddenly I was running again, back through the trees, branches tearing at me as I fled blindly. The forest no longer pushed me forward. Now it opened behind me, as if something had stopped herding me toward the stone. I didn't stop, not even when the trail straightened, not even when the air eased. I kept running until the familiar sight of my cabin roof broke through the trees. I stumbled inside, slammed the door, and dropped to the floor. My lungs were on fire, my vision blurred. Every sound made me flinch. Every shadow felt too deep. When my breathing finally slowed, I crawled to the table and pulled out my notebook. My hand shook as I wrote down everything. Every whisper, every shift in the trees, every second of the pale thing watching me. I didn't know why writing helped. Maybe it didn't. But part of me felt like leaving it unwritten would make it fade in the wrong way, as if the forest would twist the memories until I couldn't trust my own mind. When I finished, I closed the notebook and looked at the door. There was no knock, no footsteps, only a silence that felt even heavier than before. I looked out the window, toward the direction of the ridge, the direction of the stone. I knew one thing with a certainty that made my stomach twist. I had crossed a line I could not cross. And whatever lived in that forbidden zone now knew my name. The night after I found the stone doorway was worse than any night before it. I sat at the small table in my cabin, the notebook open in front of me, the lantern flame trembling with every tiny draft. The words I'd written about the pale shape and the stone already looked unreal, like something I had made up. If I had still felt my heart racing, I might have convinced myself it was just panic, just the forest playing tricks. But the silence outside was too complete, too heavy. I kept telling myself not to listen, not to wait. And yet, as the sky blackened and the trees faded into shadow, that was all I did, wait. At first, there was nothing, just the creak of old wood and the steady crackle of the lantern flame. I lay back on the cot without undressing, boots still on, jacket still zipped. My eyes burned, but I didn't want to close them. Not again. Every time I closed them, I saw that stone archway and something tall and wrong stepping through it. Maybe an hour passed. Maybe more. Time didn't feel right anymore. It stretched and snapped in odd places. Then I heard it. Not footsteps this time. Not a knock. A voice. Soft, almost gentle. Daniel. My name breathed out just beyond the window. Not loud. Not angry. Just familiar. Every muscle in my body is locked. Daniel. It sounded like my father. For a second, my heart lifted, and that was the worst part. For a tiny, stupid second, something inside me reached for it. I knew it couldn't be him. He had been dead for years, his body found near the hollow zone. But the sound of that voice tugged at some deep place in me that didn't care about logic. I sat up slowly, barely breathing. The voice drifted from the left side of the cabin, then the right, like someone walking back and forth just outside. Daniel. Come on, kiddo. That was what he used to call me. Kiddo. My throat tightened like a fist had wrapped around it. No, I whispered to myself. That's not him. That's not him. The voice went quiet for a moment, as if listening to my thoughts. Then it spoke again, but this time, something was off. The tone was just a shade too flat. The pacing is just a little too slow, like someone repeating a phrase they had heard and were trying to get right. Daniel, come on, kiddo. It lingered on each word, stretching them out. I shivered. Whatever was outside, it was learning. I didn't go to the window. I didn't answer. I lay back down and stared at the ceiling, heart pounding so hard that my chest hurt. The voice circled the cabin for what felt like hours, whispering my name in that almost familiar tone. Sometimes it sounded like my father. Sometimes it didn't sound like anyone at all. Eventually, the voice faded. The silence returned. I didn't sleep. The next day, the forest looked the same as always, and that made everything worse. The trees were tall and calm, their needles shining with dew. Birds moved from branch to branch like they always had, and a squirrel darted across my path, chattering at me for taking up too much space on its log. If it weren't for the hollowness in my chest, I might have believed nothing had changed. But night after night, it kept happening. Always after full dark. Always when the wind died. The voice returned. Sometimes it called my name in a half-whisper. Sometimes it sounded like my father. Sometimes it sounded like me, like my own voice calling from somewhere in the trees. Daniel, hey, Daniel, come on, kiddo. Each night, it came a little closer. Each night, it got a little better at sounding human. My dreams became a battlefield. I would fall asleep for minutes or for an hour at a time, dragged down by exhaustion, and every dream was the same, just with different angles. I saw my father in his ranger uniform, standing beside a trail, smiling at me the way he used to when I was little. Then his smile would stretch too wide. His eyes would slide sideways, drifting away from his face. His skin would turn pale, then gray, then almost translucent. The more I tried to focus on him, the less he looked like himself. His arms got too long. His legs bent the wrong way. His head tilted like it was hung on a loose wire. Then, when I was finally close enough to reach for him, his face would melt into that pale shape from the trees. That thing with no eyes and no real features, just a suggestion of a person stretched over something else. I always woke up gasping. The image burned into my mind. Days blurred together. I wrote what I could in the logbook, but the entries got shorter. I didn't know how to explain that my biggest threat wasn't a bear or a storm, but the sound of my own name spoken from the dark. On the fourth day after the stone doorway, Miller showed up. It was late afternoon. I was splitting wood again, trying to exhaust myself so thoroughly that my body would ignore the fear and just pass out at night. The axe rose and fell in a rhythm that almost felt safe. Hoofbeats broke that rhythm. I turned to see Miller riding up, his jaw set tight, eyes narrowed. Even from a distance, he looked angry, like he already knew what I'd done. He climbed off the horse without saying a word and tied the reins to the post. Then he walked straight toward me, boots thudding against the packed dirt. You went in, he said. It wasn't a question. I swallowed. I followed the smoke. There was a report. I did my job. You went to the ridge, he said, stepping closer. You went near the hollow. The way he said that word made goosebumps rise on my arms. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Miller's gaze hardened. I warned you. I told you to stay away from the eastern ridge. Do you think I said that because I like bossing people around? I dropped the axe and wiped sweat from my forehead. My hands were shaking. I saw something, I said softly. I think it saw me too. His shoulders sagged, and some of the anger faded, leaving something worse, fear. What did you see? He asked. I hesitated, then told him. The burned campsite, the old gear, my father's initials carved into the tree, the narrow trail that felt like it was moving beneath my feet, the whispers, the stone doorway, and the pale shape watching from the trees. I left out the voice that sounded like my father calling to me at night. I didn't know why. Maybe I wanted to keep that part to myself, like some small, twisted piece of him I could still claim. When I finished, Miller rubbed his face with both hands and swore under his breath. They should have shut this entire sector down, he muttered, all the way from the river to the ridge. But they never do. They just move the lines on the maps. Pretend it's not spreading. What is it? I asked. What's in there? He gave me a long, haunted look. You think we know? You must know something, I said. Helen told me about the hollow zone, about how the ground feels wrong, about waking up. Miller flinched at her name. She should have kept her mouth shut, he said softly, but there was no real anger there, just resignation. Still talking about it after all these years. Why didn't anyone tell me this before I came here? I asked, why put my cabin so close to it? Because officially, he said, it doesn't exist. He walked past me and leaned against the cabin wall, staring out the trees as if they might overhear. The park's been covering up disappearances since long before my time, he said. Hikers, hunters, a couple of rangers. The reports always say the same thing. Lost in bad weather, slipped near a ravine, maybe a bear attack. But the bodies we do find, they don't look right. And sometimes we don't find anything at all. No tracks, no torn gear, no blood. Just a trail that stops like the person stepped off the world. He glanced at me. Your father wasn't the only one. My chest tightened. You knew him? Not well, Miller said. I was still pretty new back then. But I remember when he went missing. I remember the search teams. I remember how the radios died near the ridge, just like they do now. And I remember the look on the faces of the rangers who found what was left of him. He lowered his voice. They said it looked like the forest had taken him apart. Not eaten, not dragged. Taken apart. Bile rose in my throat. I swallowed it down. And you think that's connected to whatever I saw? Miller nodded slowly. We don't know what it is. Creature, presence, place. I've heard it called a lot of things. Some think it's older than the park, older than the land itself. Others think it's something that slipped through from somewhere else. But this much we know. It doesn't chase people. Not like a predator. He looked at me with a kind of tired sorrow. It invites them. The words sank into me like cold water. What do you mean? I asked. It doesn't rip through the campground or break down doors, he said. It doesn't sprint after you through the trees. It waits. It whispers. It uses the things you care about, the voices you miss, the memories you can't let go. It pulls people in because they want to go, even if they don't admit it to themselves. I thought of my father's voice outside the cabin, the way it had almost broken me. So it's using him, I said, using my father. It's using whatever it can, Miller said. I had a co-worker, Larson, who worked in this sector with me years ago. He lost his sister when he was young, for weeks before he disappeared. He swore he heard her singing in the woods at night, said it was stupid, said he knew it wasn't real, but he kept stepping a little farther from the cabin each time, just to listen. Miller's jaw tightened. One morning he was gone, he said. The door is wide open, boots missing, no sign of a struggle. We followed his tracks until they reached the edge of the hollow. Then nothing. It was like he walked into a wall and vanished. My skin crawled. What did the report say? I asked. Miller laughed once, bitter and humorless. Exposure. Possibly a fall. Nobody recovered. The usual. The wind picked up slightly, whispering through the branches. It sounded almost like a voice trying to form a word. Why stay? I asked him, if you know all this, if you lost someone, why are you still here? He stared at the trees for a long time before answering. Maybe I'm stubborn, he said. Maybe I think someone needs to be out here to warn people like you. Or maybe, his voice dropped lower, maybe it's working on me too. Maybe part of me is staying, because it wants me close. The idea that even Miller, tough, quiet, steady Miller, might be under its influence made my stomach twist. I feel it, I admitted, like a tug in my chest, like a string pulling toward the ridge. Every time I close my eyes, I see that stone doorway. It feels like I just went back. If I just stepped through, I'd finally understand what happened to him. Miller turned to me sharply. That's how it starts, he said. You can't treat this like a mystery you can solve if you just get close enough. That's exactly what it wants. I met his eyes. Then what am I supposed to do? Pretend my father's death is just a story in a file? Pretend that thing isn't calling me every night? His face softened with something like pity. You're supposed to endure, he said. You finish your season, you leave, and you never come back. That's what you do. You don't give it any more of you than it's already taken. We stood there in silence for a moment, the weight of his words pressing down. Finally, he pushed away from the wall and walked back to his horse. If it starts talking to you, he said over his shoulder, you don't listen. If you hear anything that sounds like your father, you remember this. That's not him. It's just something that learned his shape. Too late, I thought. He climbed into saddle. And if it ever knocks again, he added, don't open the door. He rode off without another word, leaving me alone with the growing shadow of the ridge and the echo of his warning. That night, I didn't even pretend I could sleep. I sat in the chair by the window, lantern low, notebook open, pen in hand. My heart ticked minutes off inside my chest, slow, but steady. The forest outside faded into a solid wall of black. For a while, nothing happened. Then the wind died. The silence crawled back in. My skin prickled. From somewhere in the distance, a voice rose, faint, as if coming through water. Daniel. It sounded like my father again. Closer this time. Clearer. The tug in my chest tightened and my eyes burned. Daniel. Come on, kiddo. I squeezed my eyes shut. That's not him. I whispered. That's not him. That's not him. The floorboard under my feet vibrated gently. I realized my hands were shaking so badly that the entire chair trembled. The voice drifted from one side of the cabin to the other. Sometimes it sounded like my father, sometimes like my own voice calling from just beyond the tree line. Then came the footsteps, slow, steady, circling. I gripped the arms of the chair and stared at the door, waiting. The steps stopped. 3 slow knocks sounded, each one spaced a few seconds apart. Knock, knock, knock. The sound crawled up my spine and settled at the base of my skull. These weren't the curious, testing knocks from before. They felt patient, certain, like whatever stood outside already knew my answer. The voice spoke again, right outside the wall. Daniel, it's okay. You can open the door. Tears stung my eyes. It sounded so much like him now. The tone, the gentle way he used to wake me when we went fishing early, before the sun came up. For a heartbeat, I could almost smell his old cologne, mixed with pine and coffee. I stood before I could stop myself. My body moved toward the window like it wasn't mine. I told myself I was only going to look, just once, just to prove there was nothing there, just to prove the voice belonged to the empty forest and not to something solid and waiting. I took slow steps, each one feeling like a choice I couldn't undo. I reached the window and, with a shaking hand, lifted the edge of the curtain just enough to see outside. At first, I saw nothing but darkness and the faint outline of the trees. Then my eyes adjusted. A tall figure stood at the tree line, right where the shadows were thickest. Too tall to be a normal man. Too thin. Its skin, if it was skin, was pale, almost glowing in the dim light, like something that had never seen the sun. Its limbs were long, angles slightly wrong at the joints, like it was still trying to figure out how to stand the way a person stands. In one of its hands, it held something small and dark. A hat, a familiar ranger hat, battered and worn, the brim slightly crooked, the same kind my father used to wear in old photos. The same kind I remember grabbing off the hook when I was little, laughing as it slid over my eyes. My breath caught in my throat. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, holding the hat out to me in a slow, deliberate gesture, as if offering it back, as if returning something it thought I had lost. Daniel! The voice whispered again, drifting in from somewhere between the trees. Come on, kiddo. Just talk to me. I thought about Miller's words. It doesn't chase. It invites. I stood there, one hand on the curtain, the other pressed the glass without realizing it. My reflection stared back at me, pale and wide-eyed, layered over the tall, wrong shape in the dark. In that moment, all the fear, All the anger, all the grief I'd carried after my father's death crashed together inside me. I wanted it to be him. I wanted that more than I wanted anything else. I wanted answers. I wanted to know what he'd seen before he died. I wanted to know if he'd been afraid. The tug in my chest tightened until it hurt. All I had to do was open the door, step outside, follow it into the trees, find the truth. Or I could blow out the lantern, crawl back into bed, and pretend I hadn't seen any of it. Pretend the hat was a trick. Pretend the voice was just wind and memory. I stood at the window, caught between those two choices, as the knock echoed again in my mind, and the figure waited with impossible patience at the edge of the forest. Sooner or later, I knew I would have to choose. Stay inside, and hope it eventually forgot I existed, or follow it into the darkness and learn what waited in the hollow below. For a long moment, I stood frozen at the window, staring at the tall figure holding my father's old ranger hat. The pale shape didn't move. Its head tilted slightly, almost curious, as though it could sense the battle inside me. Behind it, the forest swayed in the faintest wind, but the branches around the creature stayed perfectly still, like it existed in a pocket of air untouched by anything else. I pressed my hand harder against the window. I didn't remember walking closer, but suddenly the glass was cold against my forehead. My breath fogged a small circle. I could smell pine and old dust leaking into the cracks of the wall. The figure shifted its weight. Just a small motion. An invitation, not a threat. "Daniel," the voice whispered again. This time it didn't sound like my father. Or me. It was something in between. A blend, a merging, as though all the voices it had gathered were speaking at once. Not loud, not angry, soft, encouraging, a sound that felt like comfort twisted into something hungry. And somehow, that soft sound hurt worse than any scream could have. I swallowed hard. My throat felt raw. "I can't," I whispered, though I wasn't sure whether I meant I couldn't follow it or I couldn't resist. When I blinked, the figure took a single step backward into the darkness. The hat hung loosely from its long fingers. Then it turned, not with a natural pivot, but with a slow, gliding rotation, like gravity worked differently around it. It began walking deeper into the trees. Every few steps, it paused and turned its head slightly, as if checking whether I was coming. I stood trembling in the cabin, the air around me thick with expectation. Then the voice came again, but this time from inside my skull, like memory and sound had fused. "Daniel, you want answers." I flinched. The lantern beside me flickered. The shadows stretched long fingers across the floor, pointing toward the door. I didn't remember deciding. My body moved anyway. I grabbed my jacket, my flashlight, my father's old compass, even though it hadn't worked since I arrived. The needle trembled wildly, as if sensing something already. I opened the cabin door. Cold night air rushed in, carrying the sharp scent of wet earth and something else. Something old, like stone that had never seen sunlight. The darkness outside felt thicker than normal, almost textured, as though I could reach out and run my fingertips across it. The figure had stopped at the edge of the clearing. When I stepped outside, it dipped its head slightly, then turned again and walked into the forest. And I followed. The first steps felt normal enough. Pine needles crunching under my boots, the cold air biting at my face, the forest stretching out in familiar shapes. But as soon as the cabin faded behind me, the trees shifted, not suddenly, not violently, but gradually, subtly. The trail didn't look right. The trees seemed taller. The path curved when I knew it should have continued straight. The moonlight dimmed, swallowed by the thick canopy overhead. Every few yards, the forest seemed to exhale, and the ground pulsed faintly beneath my feet, just enough to make me doubt my balance. The figure ahead of me drifted more than walked now. It moved between the trees effortlessly, never touching a single branch, never disturbing the leaves. The deeper we went, the stranger the forest became. Shadows stretched longer than the trees that cast them. Branches arched toward me like reaching arms. The ground sank under my weight as though it softened the more I stepped on it, like stepping across something alive. I tried turning back once. Just once. But when I spun around, the path behind me wasn't a path I'd walked. The trees leaned inward, forming a wall of interwoven branches. Where my cabin should have been miles behind, there was only darkness, thick and total. The forest didn't want me to leave. The pale figure didn't stop. I forced myself to keep going. Minutes, maybe hours, passed before I began to hear them. Voices. Not the creature's voice. Not my father's voice. Many voices. Some are low and broken. Some panicked. Some begging. Help! Someone, please. Don't leave. Don't leave me here. Mom, please. I don't want to go. They came from all around me, rising and falling, overlapping like layers of sound laid on top of one another. Some were loud. Some were faint. Some whispered so close to my ear that I flinched and stumbled forward. I knew they weren't real, but my body didn't know that. The deeper I moved, the more familiar some of the voices became. Faces I hadn't seen since childhood flickered through my memory. Relatives, neighbors, hikers who had gone missing over the years. Voices I had forgotten I'd ever heard. The forest thickened around me, funneling me in a single direction. Eventually, the figure ahead disappeared behind a curtain of leaning trees. But I kept walking, drawn by the faint glow rising through the darkness. Then I saw it, the stone archway. But it was different now. The first time I'd seen it, it had been closed, a monolith in the clearing, intimidating but dormant. Now it was open like a cave, a jagged slit where the stone had split, revealing a passage descending into darkness. Cold air spilled out of the opening, a breath from deep underground. The pale figure stood at the mouth of the cave, its long limbs silhouetted by the faint light seeping from within. It didn't turn around. It didn't acknowledge me. It simply waited. I stepped closer, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might tear itself from my chest. The ground around the stone was covered in debris, old tents, shredded fabric, rusted metal tools, scattered equipment from decades of search teams and hikers. Everything looked half decayed, half preserved, as if time moved strangely here. I saw a cracked canteen stamped with YMP, Yellowstone National Park, a Ranger radio from the 70s, a notebook, so weathered it looked like it would fall apart if I touched it. And there, near the entrance, I saw a broken compass with initials carved faintly on the metal. DH. My father's. I knelt and lifted it with trembling hands. The casing was cracked open. The needle was missing. The back was dented, like something enormous had stepped on it. My throat closed. My eyes burned. Behind me, the voices rose louder, more frantic, more desperate. Pleas for help. Screams swallowed by the darkness. Whispers calling my name like a plea and a welcome. I stood slowly. The creature drifted into the cave. I followed. Inside. The air changed, thicker, warmer, and carrying a scent like damp earth mixed with something sour, like old memories rotting in the soil. The walls pulsed faintly. The stone warmed to the touch. The passage widened, opening into a cavern lit by a dim, eerie glow that had no visible source. Shapes moved along the edges of my vision, shadows shifting like they belonged to bodies that weren't quite solid. On the ground, scattered across the stone, lay more equipment, old lanterns, broken radios, ranger hats, backpacks, jackets, paperwork, photographs. I walked slowly, reading the fragments of lives abandoned here. A faded photo of two hikers smiling beside Old Faithful. A page from a journal describing a strange humming heard near the ridge. A name tag belonging to a ranger I had only heard about in rumors. Larson. The pale creature stood near the center of the cavern, waiting for me to come closer. As I approached, its form shifted, limbs shortening, spine straightening, shoulders broadening. Then, before my eyes, it reshaped into someone I recognized instantly. My father. I staggered back, breath gone. He stood there with a familiar smile from my childhood pictures. His ranger jacket hung, just the way I remembered. His eyes are bright warm, too perfect. "Daniel," he said, and the voice was flawless. "You made it." Tears blurred my vision. I know you're not him," I whispered, though the words trembled with doubt. He stepped toward me, reaching out with a hand that looked so familiar I wanted to reach back. "I've been waiting for you," he said softly. "I wanted to show you what happened. They never told you the truth." My knees almost buckled. "I can't," I whispered, though I wasn't sure whether I meant I couldn't follow it or I couldn't resist. When I blinked, the figure took a single step backward into the darkness. The hat hung loosely from its long fingers. Then it turned, not with a natural pivot, but with a slow, gliding rotation, like gravity worked differently around it. It began walking deeper into the trees. Every few steps, it paused and turned its head slightly, as if checking whether I was coming. I stood trembling in the cabin, the air around me thick with expectation. Then the voice came again, but this time from inside my skull, like memory and sound had fused. "Daniel, you want answers." I flinched. The lantern beside me flickered. The shadows stretched long fingers across the floor, pointing toward the door. I didn't remember deciding. My body moved anyway. I grabbed my jacket, my flashlight, my father's old compass, even though it hadn't worked since I arrived. The needle trembled wildly, as if sensing something already. I opened the cabin door. Cold night air rushed in, carrying the sharp scent of wet earth and something else. Something old, like stone that had never seen sunlight. The darkness outside felt thicker than normal, almost textured, as though I could reach out and run my fingertips across it. The figure had stopped at the edge of clearing. When I stepped outside, it dipped its head slightly, then turned again and walked into the forest. And I followed. The first steps felt normal enough. Pine needles crunching under my boots, the cold air biting at my face, the forest stretching out in familiar shapes. But as soon as the cabin faded behind me, the trees shifted, not suddenly, not violently, but gradually, subtly. The trail didn't look right. The trees seemed taller. The path curved when I knew it should have continued straight. The moonlight dimmed, swallowed by the thick canopy overhead. Every few yards, the forest seemed to exhale, and the ground pulsed faintly beneath my feet, just enough to make me doubt my balance. The figure ahead of me drifted more than walked now. It moved between the trees effortlessly, never touching a single branch, never disturbing the leaves. The deeper we went, the stranger the forest became. Shadows stretched longer than the trees that cast them. Branches arched toward me like reaching arms. The ground sank under my weight as though it softened the more I stepped on it, like stepping across something alive. I tried turning back once. Just once. But when I spun around, the path behind me wasn't the path I'd walked. The trees leaned inward, forming a wall of interwoven branches. Where my cabin should have been miles behind, there was only darkness, thick and total. The forest didn't want me to leave. The pale figure didn't stop. I forced myself to keep going. Minutes, maybe hours, passed before I began to hear them. Voices. Not the creature's voice. Not my father's voice. Many voices. Some are low and broken. Some panicked. Some begging. "Help! Someone, please. Don't leave. Don't leave me here. Mom, please. I don't want to go." They came from all around me, rising and falling, overlapping like layers of sound laid on top of one another. Some were loud. Some were faint. Some whispered so close to my ear that I flinched and stumbled forward. I knew they weren't real, but my body didn't know that. The deeper I moved, the more familiar some of the voices became. Faces I hadn't seen since childhood flickered through my memory. Relatives, neighbors, hikers who had gone missing over the years. Voices I'd forgotten I'd ever heard. The forest thickened around me, funneling me in a single direction. Eventually, the figure ahead disappeared behind a curtain of leaning trees. But I kept walking, drawn by the faint glow rising through the darkness. Then I saw it, the stone archway. But it was different now. The first time I'd seen it, it had been closed, a monolith in the clearing, intimidating but dormant. Now it was open like a cave, a jagged slit where the stone had split, revealing a passage descending into darkness. Cold air spilled out of the opening, a breath from deep underground. The pale figure stood at the mouth of the cave, its long limbs silhouetted by the faint light seeping from within. It didn't turn around. It didn't acknowledge me. It simply waited. I stepped closer, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might tear itself from my chest. The ground around the stone was covered in debris, old tents, shredded fabric, rusted metal tools, scattered equipment from decades of search teams and hikers. Everything looked half decayed, half preserved, as if time moved strangely here. I saw a cracked canteen stamped with YMP, Yellowstone National Park, a Ranger radio from the 70s, a notebook, so weathered it looked like it would fall apart if I touched it. And there, near the entrance, I saw a broken compass with initials carved faintly on the metal. DH. My father's. I knelt and lifted it with trembling hands. The casing was cracked open. The needle was missing. The back was dented, like something enormous had stepped on it. My throat closed. My eyes burned. Behind me, the voices rose louder, more frantic, more desperate. Pleas for help. Screams swallowed by the darkness. Whispers calling my name like a plea and a welcome. I stood slowly. The creature drifted into the cave. I followed. Inside, the air changed, thicker, warmer, and carrying a scent like damp earth mixed with something sour, like old memories rotting in the soil. The walls pulsed faintly. The stone warmed the touch. The passage widened, opening into a cavern lit by a dim, eerie glow that had no visible source. Shapes moved along the edges of my vision, shadows shifting like they belonged to bodies that weren't quite solid. On the ground, scattered across the stone, lay more equipment, old lanterns, broken radios, ranger hats, backpacks, jackets, paperwork, photographs. I walked slowly, reading the fragments of lives abandoned here. A faded photo of two hikers smiling beside Old Faithful. A page from a journal describing a strange humming herd near the ridge. A name tag belonging to a ranger I had only heard about in rumors. Larson. The pale creature stood near the center of the cavern, waiting for me to come closer. As I approached, its form shifted, limbs shortening, spine straightening, shoulders broadening. Then, before my eyes, it reshaped into someone I recognized instantly. My father. I staggered back, breath gone. He stood there with a familiar smile from my childhood pictures. His ranger jacket hung, just the way I remembered. His eyes are bright warm, too perfect. "Daniel," he said, and the voice was flawless. "You made it." Tears blurred my vision. I know you're not him," I whispered, though the words trembled with doubt. He stepped toward me, reaching out with a hand that looked so familiar I wanted to reach back. "I've been waiting for you," he said softly. "I wanted to show you what happened. They never told you the truth." My knees almost buckled. "Where the hell have you been?" he demanded. I don't know," I said. It was the only honest answer I had. Miller's grip tightened for a moment, then loosened. He scanned my face, my clothes, my hands, as if checking for injuries. "You've been gone," he said. "We've been calling for you on the radio for over a day." "A day?" I croaked. "No, it was last night. I was at the cabin. I wrote everything down." My voice broke. I looked down at my clothes. They were stained with dirt, sap, and something dark I didn't want to name. My notebook wasn't with me. Neither was my lantern. Just my dead radio and a cracked compass in my pocket. "Time doesn't behave right near that place," Miller said quietly. "You're lucky we found you at all." He helped me onto the horse, steadying me when my legs tried to give out. As we rode back along the river, the forest shifted again, but this time it was subtle. Small changes in the way the light fell, the way the air felt, like the land was trying to decide which version of itself to show us. Neither of us spoke for a while. Finally, I said, "You saw it, didn't you?" Or something. Miller's jaw worked. He stared straight ahead. "I saw enough," he said. "What does that mean?" He didn't answer. "You went near the hollow to find me." I pressed. "You must have felt it. Heard it." His fingers tightened on the reins. "I'm not talking about it," he said. "Not out here." "Why not?" He turned his head just enough to meet my eyes. The look there was worse than fear. It was surrender. Because talking about it is another way of feeding it, he said. You want to put in one more story, one more report, one more late-night confession. I like that. It's like a question in your mind. Silence fell between us, heavy as the air near the cave had been. We reached the outpost closest to my sector first. He got me off the horse and into a small office, sat me down, and shoved a bottle of water into my hand. My fingers felt clumsy around it. He picked up my radio, turned the dial, and smacked it against the desk once. Static exploded from the speaker. It wasn't normal static. It was layered and broken, like 1,000 distant voices speaking all at once through thick glass. For a moment, my skin crawled. Then, clear and soft in the middle of the noise, I heard it. Daniel, my father's voice. I snatched the radio from Miller. Did you hear that? The static cut off as suddenly as it had started. The radio went dead. Miller's face had gone even paler. Yeah, he said hoarsely. I heard it. We stared at each other, the dead radio between us. After a moment, he said, You need to write your report, the official one. So I did. Back at the main station, I sat at a desk under bright fluorescent lights that made everything feel too sharp and too fake. My hands shook as I filled out the incident form. Smoke sighting. Possible old campsite fire. Equipment interference. Ranger disoriented. Lost time. Every time I started to write stone cave, or voice that sounded like my father, or shape that isn't human, my pen hovered above the paper and refused to move. I could see the words in my head. I could imagine the way they'd look in block letters. I could just as easily imagine a reaction. So I kept it vague. When I turned the report in, the supervisor glanced over it, frowned at a few sections, then sighed and stamped it. We'll mark it as an environmental hazard note, he said. You probably ran into a patch of bad gas from underground vents. Messes with your head. Happens. I stared at him. You really believe that? He met my eyes. That's what the file will say, he replied. You should take some leave. You look like hell. In that moment, I realized two things. One, I was never going to win against that place by trying to fight it in paperwork. And two, I couldn't stay in Yellowstone. That evening, sitting on my cabin cot with my pack half filled, I made my decision. I wrote a letter instead of a log entry, not an official report, just a note to myself, folded and tucked into the notebook I brought back from town to replace the one I lost. I'm done, I wrote. I can't live next to a place that knows my father's name and now knows mine. I resigned the next morning. The process was oddly simple. A few forms, a few signatures, a sad kind of nod from Miller, who stood by the door with his arms crossed like he'd been expecting this the whole time. You're doing the smart thing, he said. It doesn't feel smart, I told him. It feels like running. Sometimes running is the only winning move, he said. You don't owe that thing your life, too. I left most of my gear behind. Standard issue stuff that could go to the next ranger. The only things I kept were my father's broken compass and the empty space where his hat should have been. On my last day, I couldn't make myself leave without seeing the ridge one more time. I knew it was a bad idea. I knew going back even near that place was like walking along the edge of a cliff in the dark. But something in me needed to look at it one last time and say, you didn't get me. Not all of me, anyway. So instead of heading straight out of the park, I took the long trail. The forest was quiet, but not in the same heavy way as before. Birds still sang. Squirrels still chattered. The wind moved through the branches with a soft sigh. If someone else had walked that path, they would have said it was peaceful. But I knew better. When I reached the overlook where I could see the ridge, everything looked normal, boring, even just a line of trees, rock formations in the distance, sunlight catching on the river below. No pale figures, no stone doorway, no strange fog or bending shadows. To anyone else, it was just another part of Yellowstone, one more postcard view in a park full of them. I stood there a long time, listening. At first, there was only wind and the distant rush of water. Then, faintly, just at the edge of hearing, I thought I heard something else. A breath, a murmur, like someone speaking from very far away, through layers of earth and memory. I didn't stay to figure out the words. I turned and walked away, the ridge shrinking behind me with every step. I didn't look back again. That was the last day I worked as a ranger. I moved back to a small town where the loudest thing at night was a passing truck or a dog barking 2 streets over. I took a quiet job, tried to live a quiet life. But here's the thing. Silence follows you. Some nights, when everything is still and the house feels too small, I lie awake and listen. Most of the time, all I hear is a hum of distant traffic and my own breathing. But sometimes when the wind dies and the world seems to lean in, I hear something else. A pause, a gap, a wrong kind of quiet. And in that quiet, I hear him. Daniel, soft, almost gentle, not quite human. My father's voice or the memory of it, or something that I learned it too well. I don't answer. I don't get up. I don't go to the window. Instead, I do what I'm doing right now. I tell the story, which brings us back to you, listening to this on your screen, maybe in the dark, maybe with headphones on, maybe planning a trip to Yellowstone someday. Headphones on, maybe planning a trip to Yellowstone someday. If you ever do go, if you ever find yourself on a trail and notice the forest getting a little too still, a little too quiet, like the whole world is holding its breath, listen to me. If a bird stops singing, if your compass starts spinning, if you feel that soft tug in your chest and hear your name spoken from somewhere you can't quite see, turn around, walk the other way. Some parts of that park aren't meant for us. Some paths aren't really paths, they're invitations. And sometimes, even now, far from the pines and the ridges and the stone, I still hear my father calling my name. Sometimes I tell myself it's just a memory. And sometimes I think he's getting closer.